The moment the billionaire stood up from his golden chair, took the trembling waitress by the hand, and announced she would become his wife, the entire ballroom fell into a silence so heavy it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. Crystal glasses froze mid-air, whispered judgments died on painted lips, and the so-called perfect guests, draped in diamonds and arrogance, stared in disbelief as if reality had just betrayed them. And in the center of it all stood a young woman in a simple uniform, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, while beside her stood a man who owned half the city, choosing her over everything money could buy. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of seeing someone's true heart beyond their status, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because stories like this remind us what truly matters. Ethan Caldwell had built his empire from nothing. In New York City, his name meant power, influence, and wealth beyond imagination. But behind the tailored suits and million-dollar deals was a man quietly exhausted by a world that judged everything by status. He had attended countless galas, dinners, and charity events where smiles were fake and conversations hollow. And on that particular night, the grand charity banquet at a luxurious Manhattan hotel felt no different, until he noticed her. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She wasn't meant to be noticed. She moved silently between tables, carrying trays, refilling glasses, and avoiding eye contact as much as possible. Her uniform was simple, her shoes slightly worn, and her posture careful, as if she had trained herself not to take up too much space in a world that rarely noticed people like her. But what caught Ethan's attention wasn't her appearance, it was the way she treated others. While the wealthy guests dismissed staff with cold indifference, Clara smiled softly at everyone. She helped an elderly guest adjust his chair without being asked. She quietly cleaned a spill someone else had made, taking the blame when a manager scolded her. And when she thought no one was watching, she slipped a small piece of bread into her pocket, likely saving it for later. There was something deeply human about her, something untouched by the arrogance surrounding them. Ethan couldn't stop watching her. In a room full of perfection, she was the only one who felt real. As the evening progressed, the guests began to grow louder, their laughter sharper, their conversations more superficial. Among them was Vanessa Sterling, a woman known as much for her beauty as her cruel attitude. She had long assumed she would one day marry Ethan, believing it was simply the natural order of things, wealth paired with wealth, status with status. But Ethan had never seen her the way she saw herself. When Clara accidentally brushed past Vanessa's chair, causing a few drops of wine to spill onto her designer gown, the room shifted. Vanessa stood up slowly, her expression filled with outrage, as if a crime had been committed against royalty. The music softened, conversations paused, and all eyes turned toward the young waitress who now stood frozen, her face pale with fear. Vanessa's words cut through the silence like a blade, mocking Clara's background, her job, and her worth. She spoke as if Clara wasn't even human, reducing her to nothing more than a mistake in the room. The other guests watched, some uncomfortable, others entertained, but no one stepped in. No one except Ethan. Something inside him snapped, not out of anger alone, but out of a deep, overwhelming realization of how broken the world around him had become. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor, and walked straight toward Clara. The room held its breath. Clara expected to be fired, humiliated, or worse. Her hands trembled as she tried to apologize, her voice barely forming words. But instead of anger, Ethan looked at her with something she hadn't seen in a long time, respect. He gently took the tray from her hands and placed it on a nearby table. Then, in front of everyone, he held her hand, not as a gesture of pity, but as a declaration. And then he said the words no one would ever forget. He announced that he would marry her. At first, people thought it was a joke. A billionaire marrying a waitress. It sounded like something out of a fantasy, not reality. But Ethan's expression never changed. There was no humor in his eyes, no hesitation in his voice. He wasn't playing a game. He was making a choice. Vanessa's face turned pale with shock. The guests began whispering, their perfect composure cracking under the weight of disbelief. Some laughed nervously, others shook their heads, but none could deny the truth standing before them. Clara, however, was overwhelmed. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. She didn't see herself as someone worthy of such a life. She had spent years believing she was invisible, that her dreams were too small to matter. And now, in a single moment, everything had changed. The days that followed were anything but easy. The media exploded with headlines, mocking and questioning Ethan's decision. Social circles turned against him, accusing him of losing his mind. Even within his company, people whispered doubts. And Clara faced her own battles, feeling out of place, judged, and unsure of whether she truly belonged in his world. But Ethan never wavered. He didn't try to change Clara. He didn't ask her to become someone else. Instead, he showed her that her kindness, her humility, and her strength were exactly what the world needed. Slowly, Clara began to see herself through his eyes, not as a waitress, but as a person of incredible worth. And as time passed, something remarkable happened. Clara didn't just adapt to her new life, she transformed it. She used Ethan's resources to support struggling families, to create opportunities for people who had once been invisible, just like she had been. She built programs that gave waitresses, cleaners, and workers a chance to rise, proving that kindness and compassion could exist even in the highest levels of society. The same people who had once mocked her now admired her. Not because of her wealth, but because of her heart. And Vanessa? She faded into the background, her arrogance no match for the quiet strength Clara carried every day. Years later, at another grand event, the same ballroom told a very different story. Clara stood beside Ethan, not as someone who had been chosen, but as someone who had earned her place through resilience and grace. The guests looked at her with respect, and the atmosphere no longer felt cold or hollow. Because one man had dared to see beyond status, and one woman had dared to believe she was more than the world told her. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. Your support helps spread stories of kindness and hope. And before this story ends, I have a special request for you. Comment below the word believe if you think kindness can still change lives, no matter how broken the world feels. Because sometimes, the most unexpected moments become the beginning of something extraordinary. And sometimes, all it takes is one person to see your worth, for the entire world to change.